You're watching the Forefront Church video podcast. And wherever you're at viewing online, we just want to say thank you and welcome. And one of the ways that we can help connect with you is we want to hear from you and where you're at and how we can help. And so head over to forefrontchurch.info after the message and click the Connect tab. It's a great way for us to help you along your spiritual journey as you connect with God and learn about Jesus. And so sit back, relax. We hope that you're challenged and encouraged from today's message.
George Washington wrote that every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those who are present. So what he's saying here is that everything that we do, everything that we say, everything that we're about, we need to be aware of who else is in the room. We need to be respectful of the potential impact that we have on them. Now, he penned those in a little book called George Washington's Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Conversation and Company. And he wrote it when he was 14 years old. Very interesting. There's 110 rules in here. That's the very, very first rule. And what he was talking about was civility and decent behavior. What does that mean? He sat and thought about all of the situations that he might find himself in where he would have an impact on other people, and he made the decision that he was going to be decent and civil and well-behaved and courteous. But these were not his ideas, actually. He did not come up with them. They were first composed by French Jesuits in the late 1600s. Now, a Jesuit was a society of the Catholic Church, and what they did was they taught people about Jesus. They evangelized, or they taught people about Jesus, and people came to faith, and they held training classes about Jesus. And so the Jesuits actually wrote all these down, and George Washington wrote them in his own hand when he was 14 years old as part of a penmanship class in school. But what George Washington did was he embodied them. In fact, when you read the history of George Washington, you read about what a gentleman he was and how considerate he was and how careful he was around other people. Historian Richard Brookhiser, who wrote about George Washington, said that these rules were very, very important to him, that he believed what the Jesuits believed, that when you practice civility, when you're intentional about it, you will over time shape how you are as your outer persona, let's say, and that will have the impact of contributing to the development of your inner person. And what would happen was an enduring example would always emerge when you were around other people. But if you read this book, and it's very short, I mean, there's 110 rules in here. The language is hard because it was written back in George Washington's time. And some of the situations don't necessarily exist anymore. We don't run across them anymore. But I thought it would be kind of cool to look at a couple of his rules and then how they might be written today. So, for instance, Rule 38 says, in visiting the sick, this is George Washington, do not presently play the physician if you be not knowing therein. All right? He might write it this way today. Do not offer to search the internet for a friend's illness symptoms and deliver your findings, and never, ever relay the details of your distant relative's medical horror story to a person who is ill. Don't do that. Rule number 60, written by George Washington, be not immodest in urging your friends to discover a secret. He might write it today. Don't overshare, especially on Facebook. That's a good one. Here's my favorite, rule number 99. Drink not too leisurely, nor yet too hastily. Before and after drinking, wipe your lips. Breathe not then or ever with too great a noise, for it's uncivil. Clearly, this is George Washington's way of saying, check yourself before you wreck yourself, right? So, show of hands, who thinks we should be more courteous and civil, right? Here, somebody, here, you need to have this book. You raised your hand. Not that I know you or anything and you need that book. But for those of you that are online and those of you who are joining us today here, there's a theme that runs through the pages of that book, through what the Jesuits wrote and what they said, and it's something that's difficult today, is that we are very much focused on ourselves, kind of like that Toby Keith song, Talk About Me. It really is not about us, although we like to say that. But those rules have a common thread, and that is others, that we should be setting ourselves aside for other people in all kinds of situations. The focus should be on other people. We should be willing to make small sacrifices so that we can bring the best to a situation. And we've been in this series called Church for the City, where we've been learning just that. How do we grow as people so that we can make the best impact on the people around us in our city? And what it means is that we need to change so that we can show others who Jesus is, so we would deny ourselves and serve the community better. That's what we've been in this series. Let's pray before we get going. God, thank you so much for today. Thank you that we can take a tongue-in-cheek look at things that we lack in doing. Civility, discourse, just boils down to how do we love well. And you have given us a lot to think about in the course of this series. How do we be people who follow you, who actually love well, and therefore then love those around us in our city and beyond? So whatever we need to hear today, God, help us that we would take something away that would make us better. We love you and we pray this in your name. Amen. So every week we go to a particular part of the Bible to learn whatever it is that we're talking about. And you can get an easy-to-read version of the Bible at our Get Connected area in the lobby. Those guys would love to see you and be able to hand off a Bible to you. You can also kind of go to our digital hub here at forefrontchurch.info. You can follow along there. I've put some notes in there that kind of talks about what we're going to be talking about today. There's an accompanying Bible study that goes along and with this, what we're talking about today and the entire series. And what we've been talking about is this city in the ancient biblical text called Corinth. And we're talking about the guy who wrote it. His name was Paul. And he planted a church there. He started a church there. And we've been looking at what was going on in Corinth at the time and how is the church dealing with the culture of the time. Because we know that Corinth was the center of Greek culture in its day. We know that there was a lot of pleasure-seeking going on. There were pagan religions. There were a lot of materialism going on there. It was a center of commerce and culture. Should sound very familiar to what's going on today. And what Paul would do is he would write different letters to the various churches that he had planted, and he had some themes and some concerns. But in this particular church in Corinth, he was very concerned because he was starting to hear things. Now, Paul, his goal was always Jesus, letting people know about Jesus, putting churches in place for people to come to Jesus, because that's what happened for him. But he also instructed churches. He saw where they were having trouble, and he wanted them to be better, so he would talk to them through letters. And he was troubled by what he was hearing, because if Paul had his primary mission being the person of Jesus, he was very sensitive to people who were new to faith, who were just coming to faith, or who were weak in faith and weren't really sure what they believed yet. And he was beginning to hear things out of the Corinthian church that was bothering him. And he had good reason. The Corinthian church was deeply divided. They had stunning disloyalty going on. The leadership was very much off the rails. People were not being very nice to each other. I know that all sounds very odd that would happen, but he saw that these behaviors were having a negative impact on the central mission of the church, which is to help people come into a knowledge of Jesus, a knowledge of God, and then they would get to a point where maybe they would commit their life to that. And what he saw was that these behaviors were out of step with that message, out of step with God's wisdom, and they were losing their effectiveness. And so that's what we've been looking at in this Church for the City. We've been looking at the church at Corinth, and we've been asking ourselves, how can we make sure that we don't fall into the same trap? And what we're really asking ourselves today is this question: will it be about me or will it be about we? whether it's George Washington, the Jesuits, Paul, the Bible, we all wrestle with questions every day when we speak, talk, act, interact. If we have more than one person in the room, is what I'm about to do, am I basing my decision on it being just something for me, or am I more concerned about the we? As a person of faith, do I need to care about what people think about what I say? Do I need to have any concern about the impact of others in the way that I carry myself and the way that I behave? If you're a person here who does not yet have a relationship with God, or the idea of a relationship with Jesus is foreign to you, hopefully you will start to cheer in your head, because you should have every expectation that when you meet somebody of faith, that they're going to be loving, kind, compassionate, patient. You can let the adjectives run wild if you want. Because George Washington said every action done in company ought to be with respect for the impact that it has on others. But many live by the mantra of, hey, if it doesn't bother anybody else, like, why should I care? If I'm not hurting anybody, who cares? But there's a whole insurance industry that would say no. Like, if you're 16 to 25 years old and you're male, you're paying more for car insurance than anybody on the planet. Because 16 to 25-year-old males, statistically speaking, they have more accidents, they put more people in the car, they don't wear seatbelts, they're risk takers. So if you're just a very good 16 to 25-year-old and you don't do all that, you're impacted by those that don't. It's just a fact of life. How about people who insist on writing checks in the grocery line? That has an impact on all of us. If you do that, I'm just teasing. Please don't get angry with me. But the one that really chaps my hide, those of you that are decorating for Christmas in October, really? You know what, you're putting pressure on the whole country, the whole world doing that. I'm just kidding. But we're going to be in a section of 1 Corinthians chapter 8 where Paul is hearing about something that is going on that is having a really big impact on the church and is causing problems. So we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. We're going to begin in verse 1. It's going to be up here on the screen, and you can follow along. This is Paul. Now, about food sacrificed to idols. We know that we all possess knowledge, but knowledge puffs up while love builds up. So let's talk about a couple of things here. An idol. An idol is nothing more than a worthless object or kind of a perceived object, animate or inanimate, that we worship. And in this case, there were some ceremonies that were developing and had developed where there were idols, little, meaningless gods, and they were sacrificing animals to it. So it was a little bit about meat sacrificed to an idol. And what Paul is saying, look, what you're doing here. You have developed something that is outside of God, outside of what I taught you. It's very odd. You've gotten very smart about it, apparently, and you've forgotten what the main thing is here. He says, look, you're all very smart, but you're not as smart as you think you are. When you're smart, when you're knowledgeable, what always accompanies that is love. And if you're going to meander out into this other area and worship something that isn't true, then you've abandoned God and love starts to exit the equation. And when love starts to exit the equation, you're not as smart as you think you are. You know what happens? You get really smart about something. Back when I was a kid, we used to call somebody a know-it-all, That's what was happening here. In verse 2, he says, look, those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. What he was saying here is just because you have some knowledge doesn't mean that you're spiritual. You can be knowledgeable, but if you're knowledgeable at the expense of everything else, if there isn't one shred of you going, maybe I don't know everything that's going on, he says that's a problem, because if you were to do that, you would see that you have to live in the knowledge that there is God. You would want to live with the knowledge that God is about your life and about your practices, not this other stuff that you're into. And he said, the reason why I know this is whoever loves God is known by God. He said, I planted this church. We put it here. You came to Christ. You came to a knowledge of God. You started to live your life for him. You obviously had some reverence to him before. And he's saying, when you do, you don't forget where you came from. You don't forget what I taught you. You don't create other things that are pointless idols and worthless. You follow me. So he gets back to the point. In verse 4, he says, so then about eating food sacrificed to idols, we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. He said, idols are pointless. You've forgotten that there is only one God. And here's the net effect of this. When we start to go out and operate on our own, when we say that we're people of faith and we start to act differently from that, we know that society is easily swayed. We can be easily swayed. We can be deceived. We can be deceptive. People start to see things different in us, and then all of a sudden we're not that. It begins to cause some confusion. This is what Paul was concerned about, because Jesus is drifting further and further away. The mission of the church is going away. In verse 5, he says, okay, let's say there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords. Yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things came and for whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. He's saying, look, don't be distracted. Don't be confused. Remember that your God was God. His Son was Jesus. Why did he come here? He came here for you. So live for him. Understand that your actions, your words, your behaviors, your little nuances of your personality that aren't so attractive are going to have an impact, because the more you forget about whom you serve and whom saved you, the further away you're going to get from that. In verse 7, he says, not everyone possesses knowledge. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat sacrificial food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to a god, and since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. When he says, okay, you built all this up, you thought it was good and true, you're a human being, I get that, but it doesn't make it true. Slowly over time, this faith that you had has been chipped away by this idea that you know better. It's abandoning faith. It's taking my eyes off what the impact could be. When I was a boy, I was hiking with a friend of mine, and we were on a very steep, almost cliff face, and I was down below where he was, and we were being very careful about coming down very carefully. And he took a step that he thought was safe, and he dislodged a very large rock, which rolled down and knocked me off to the bottom. Now, he didn't mean to do that. He was trying to find what he perceived was safe footing, but it really wasn't. And we do this all the time. Sometimes we do it on purpose. Sometimes we do it not on purpose, but we'll step somewhere, we'll say something, we'll do something. We don't think about the impact that it had. And Paul tells us this. He says, food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. He said it was absolutely pointless. We do things all the time that are pointless. Right now, there's a Cowboy fan somewhere at a tailgate party yelling, how about them Cowboys? He knows it's November. He knows they're going to lose every game in December, or they're going to get bounced out of the playoffs in the first round. But he's going to continue to do it. It's absolutely pointless. Verse 9, key verse. Paul says here, all this pointless stuff. Anytime you see like be careful and then however in the Bible, stand by, okay? That exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. Be careful about that. What you think doesn't matter, matters. What you think you say that doesn't have an impact, it does. What Paul was saying here is that your self-centered insistence on your own rights has an impact. And it's oftentimes at the expense of the weak. It damages others. It reduces the effectiveness of the church. It actually makes people walk away from faith instead of towards faith. It actually keeps people from coming to know who Jesus is instead of wanting to know who he is. Think about all of the things that we believe that we have a right to. I can say whatever I want. I can post whatever I want. I can behave however we want. We interact daily with people, and sometimes just out of our own subconscious, we say things and do things that are not good. Paul says it's unwise to have a focus on yourself. The Jesuits wrote all that stuff out. It's picked up by the first president of the United States, who thought it was so compelling that he writes a whole book about it. Every single action is predicated on its impact to another person. Think about that. Again, the question, will it be about me, or is it going to be about the we? Y'all remember some years ago where the term just saying was big? Y'all remember that? Like everybody tacked that on to everything. And it started out very innocently. I actually did a little research on it. It started very innocently. Somebody would go to a restaurant and go, I don't know what you think has the best chocolate cake, but this is it, just saying. And, it was funny and stuff. But then people started using just saying as kind of a rudeness, get out of jail free card. They would start to say things that were not very nice. I don't know what you think about the way she just sang the national anthem, but just saying. And they would say all kinds of things like that and about politicians or whatever. And then they would use the double imperative, like they wanted to get really mean. They would say, I don't know what's going on with so-and-so. I'm not saying, I'm just saying. They would say that. It was just sort of this idea that I can be rude no matter what as long as I tack that on to the end of it. And this is what Paul would say about something like that. It has an impact. Because if somebody has a weak conscience, or they're weak in their faith, or they're not quite there yet, or you don't know them and they're looking at you, and they see you with all your knowledge, eating meat in the idol's temple, won't that person be emboldened to eat what is sacrificed to idols? Won't they be emboldened to do whatever they want? Because here's a person of faith. They're walking around doing it. What's the big deal if I do it? We go to church. We claim faith. We present what we want people to see. But then there's other times we feel like we can say or do whatever when it suits us, ignoring how it impacts others or not remembering about it. The Corinthians' idol was this idea of meat and how they were celebrating it and how they were distracting and diverting the attention from Jesus. We do the same thing when we make idols like anger and unforgiveness and being selfish. These are actions that are not representative of God. We're trading somebody's hope for our own desire to be however we want, and we're either blinded by it or we just ignore it. And what Paul is saying here is this. So this weak brother or sister for whom Christ died, what he's saying here is everybody in this room, everybody that's ever been born, God loves and cares about, and Jesus died for them. What we are doing when we step out in an uncivil manner, when we think about nobody but ourselves, their faith is destroyed by our knowledge, our actions. What Paul's trying to say here, and it's as pertinent today as it was back then and every time in between, is that our stumbling block is selfishness and arrogance at the end of the day. And those are tough things to hear, but it's true. And sometimes it happens in ways that we would never admit. Sometimes it comes out in our anger. Sometimes it comes out in the way we conduct our lives with the biases that we have. It's believing the worst in somebody. It's talking about people badly. It's being unteachable. It's being arrogant. Paul would say this is puffed up knowledge. And what he says here is that it not only puts distance between you and the other person, but it puts distance between us and God, and it may permanently keep distance between them and God. It actually causes people out of faith to wonder why even bother following Jesus. So about, 30 years ago easily, I was in a class of other people. I was in the Navy. I was in a class of about 30 people, and we had all just been commissioned officers out of the enlisted ranks. So they send you to a special school to kind of scrub off all the rough edges before they let you go out and be an officer. So we had to go down in this class, and one of the classes we had in that course was a class on etiquette. So we all had to dress up really, really nicely in our white uniforms, and we went to a formal luncheon where they taught us literally which fork and which knife to use depending on which course of the meal came out. Now, there was a guy in my class who I really liked and I gotten to know a little bit, but there was something different about him. Back then, he would call himself a born-again Christian. So he was a person who knew Jesus, followed Jesus, and he kept trying to tell me about Jesus. We never really had the talk, but I just liked the way he carried himself. I liked the way that he way that he talked. I liked the way that he interacted with people. So we're at this luncheon, and they're bringing out the different courses, and he's like 2 people from me. We're in our dress whites. Everything's great. And they bring out the soup, tomato soup. You can probably tell what's going to happen here, right? So the server brings his tomato soup and spills it all over him, okay? Now, I think there's probably an appropriate response for something like that. Obviously, the uniform's ruined. That's just the way it goes. He was bordering on a loss of self-control. He yelled at the server. He demeaned her. He caused a scene. The rest of us were in various stages of laughing at him, mocking him, disbelief, trying to help her, etc. And I remember thinking very clearly at age 28, why would I ever be that? Why would I ever do that? Why would I ever want to have anything to do with somebody who was just stoically, I'm Mr. Spiritual, Mr. Jesus 1 minute, and just absolutely degrading another human being the next? What's lost here? Love, Jesus. Any opportunity that he had to make somebody who was feeling really bad better, he completely blew it out of the water. The Corinthians did the same thing. And we do the same thing. The Corinthians were blinded by, in some cases, I'm sure it was a well-meaning attempt at worship, but there were some there who thought they knew better. And we are blinded sometimes by that. Sometimes we're blinded by our perceived spirituality. Sometimes we're blinded by our knowledge. Sometimes we're blinded by our rightness, and we influence people in the wrong way because we have blind spots that we don't see. We don't conduct ourselves in a civil manner, like George Washington said, because sometimes we can't see how we act, and we can't see how we act because we have blind spots. I recently had to replace a vehicle, and it's got some collision avoidance stuff in this one, which is kind of nice. And it's got a blind spot indicator on the side view mirror. So it lets me know when somebody's there. Because you know when you're you're driving a vehicle down the road, you can't see. And what happens if you don't hold your lane, you move over, you're going to cause damage, you're going to impact somebody. We all have blind spots. We have sarcasm. We have short-temperedness. We are sometimes discourteous. We're sometimes not polite. Those are blind spots, and sometimes I don't see them. Sometimes they crop up when a difficult person I have an encounter with or you do. You know what your blind spots are, and Paul called it. He said when you sin against them, meaning when you distract them, when you start to pull them away by your behavior, in this way you wound their weak conscience and you sin against Christ. He's actually saying that it is a sin to call yourself a Christian and then cause somebody to wonder why they would even be what you claim that you are. It's very, very difficult. So we have to ask ourselves, we have to be sober. What are my blind spots? That's what Paul was telling the Corinthian church. Look at your blind spot here. What are ours? We need to be sober and go, hey, is what I'm about to say going to impact somebody negatively? Is what I'm about to do going to hurt somebody? Am I getting ready to drive into somebody's lane? Do I need to check myself before I wreck myself? Because it's going to happen if I'm not careful. And Paul would say, you absolutely do. He says, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again so that I will not cause them to fall. Leading by example. Not speaking or acting in a way that negatively impacts others. If you're going to call yourself a person of faith, it's stepping up and being a person of faith. Being a church for the city is exemplifying the hope in Jesus in every annoying little interaction that you have with somebody because he saved us. He came and saved you and saved me. And Paul said, check yourself. We all have pockets. Think about your pockets of blind spots, your pockets of anger or bias or frustration or irritation. Think about those. Are those things puffing you up, or are they causing you to go, no, wait, I need to be something different. I need to be something better. What do your kids see? What do your coworkers see? Are you polite? Do you go the extra mile, or do you cut corners? Do you make life hard for people, or do you make it easier for them? To be a person of God, we need to exemplify hope. I truly believe that a reliance on God and acting in a civil manner creates a platform called love and hope. And once you can get love and hope firmly cemented in who you are, you can carry anybody along in any situation, in any disagreement, in every tough time. Yes, they have a responsibility. That's up to them. But to the extent that you have any control over a particular situation, remember that love and hope carries things way more than anything else could, because God formed us new. He deepens our reliance on Him, not our own self-serving sense of ourselves. Let's go out. Let's keep an eye on our blind spots. Let's hold our lane. Let's watch. Let's take a sober assessment as to where we are. Let's really be people who are going to be a church for the city. Let's go out and be like nobody they ever encountered. Let's be about we, not me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Forefront Church video podcast. Our hope and prayer is that this has left you encouraged and challenged you in your faith. And you might have some questions and some ways that you want to figure this out, and we want to help with that. Head over to forefrontchurch.info, and there's a couple different ways that you can connect. Click the Connect tab and let us know how we can be praying for you, or a staff member can be contacting you this week. Maybe you have just been encouraged by this and want to support the ministry here at Forefront Church. You can click the Giving tab, as well as other tabs that are in there to help you along in your journey with God. And so we're thankful for you. Thanks for tuning in, and we cannot wait to see you again here online on the video podcast. We love you, and we'll see you then.